Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group. Please note, the views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker. The Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. In this talk, Simon Barber tells us about Mike Hawthorn, also known as the Farnham Flyer, who was Britain's first Formula One world champion in 1958.
I am grateful to be here to talk about one of my heroes, John Michael Hawthorn, who was a local lad. Well, he was originally from Yorkshire, a mining village called Mexborough, but basically he was, in his day, the golden boy of motor racing. A very, very short life, but a high-profile figure in his time. He was quite a unique figure. He was born on the 10th of April 29, died 1959, but he certainly crammed an awful lot into a very short period of time. He became the first British Formula One world champion driver in 1958, but he lived as he drove, competitive to the last. He would have no doubt given James Hunt a run for his money in his day. And in fact, there are similarities in terms of lifestyle and character, personality. So very outgoing, very gregarious, and obviously very popular, especially with the ladies. Colourful, busy. If anything, motor racing at that time was at its zenith because people just wanted to celebrate the end of the war. They wanted to release some of that tension and frustration. They wanted to enjoy themselves. Motor racing, one of those things that you could go to. We did have quite a number of tracks that were much busier than they are today. Many books have been written about Mike, and a number of enthusiast groups exist around this area and also internationally. Can't believe that an acquaintance of ours in Australia has been desperate to come to this presentation. It's amazing how international a figure Mike was, especially as his fellow racers were people like Sterling Moss, who actually obviously had a higher profile, but then again he raced for a lot longer. I can't pretend to be an expert on all aspects of Mike's life, but I just wanted to cover some of those high points in the brief time I've got today. Some areas I think are important from a local and world history point of view. And the best book, if you ever wanted to pick one up and have a more detailed read, is probably Mike Hawthorn, The Golden Boy of Motor Racing. You can find that on the internet, or you can find it in the library. So Mike was born 10th of April 1929 in Mexborough. Family moved to Farnham in 1931. Mike's father, Leslie, was actually a champion motorcyclist. This is largely where the money came from to invest in Tourist Trophy Garage. And of course, Hawthorn still exists now. They've got two locations. They've got a sales department in East Street, and they've still got the Station Hill garage for servicing vehicles. They've got nice photographs in there. A ridiculous sum of money was recently paid by the owner of the business for 4 signed photographs of Mike outside Tourist Trophy. I think he bought them at Sotheby's. They were about £25,000 each. The cars sold at Tourist Trophy included Jaguar, Maserati and Ferrari. They dealt in high-end motor cars. There was a very close link with Jaguar with Mike early on. He was one of the earliest Jaguar team drivers. He then moved on to Ferrari because he was virtually headhunted by Enzo Ferrari later in his career. Leslie, I shan't use the word snobbish, but he was very keen that his son would grow up to be a young Surrey gentleman. And one of the reasons for moving to Farnham was to actually raise his profile, moving to the south, living in Surrey, he felt was the best place for him to be. However, he didn't actually live long enough to see Mike's main successes. He died in a road accident coming back from Goodwood, one of his favourite racing tracks, on a motorbike in 1954. During these years, Mike was infected with a passion for racing from a very early age, so already the damage was done, if you like. Went to Barfield Prep School, a rather average scholar. He preferred sport to academics, and most people were quite amazed when he passed a common entrance exam to Ardingly College, which was quite a tough public school. His nickname there was Snowball. He was almost albino when he was young. But he left school in 1946 to pursue his love of cars and motorcycles, and of course his father had the garage business then, so he wanted to get more involved in that. And the rest really is history. Some of the early notable successes: he won the 1955 24-hour Le Mans driving a Jaguar. This is something that is very relevant to Mike's success in racing, but it was also the most tragic event in motor racing history, never to be repeated, thank goodness. I think it was about 86 died eventually. It was a tragedy that people couldn't quite believe had happened. As happened in those days, the race carried on. Well over 100 people were injured as well. He was the first British Formula One champion in 1958, driving Ferrari. But it's important to recognise that this was the most dangerous place to be in sport. It was a deadly time in motorsport, no computer-aided technology in the cockpit. Everybody was basically their own boss. There was nobody with magic fingers helping you brake or anything else. Typical sporting attire in those days, normally a bow tie, no fire retardant materials then. The devil-may-care type attitude that Mike had continued throughout his life, whether socially or whether seriously racing. The Farnham family home was in Stephendale Road, but as Mike reached adulthood, his parents sadly separated. His mother, Winifred, was devoted to her son. They only had one child, and he was basically the apple of her eye. Leslie's motivations were slightly different. I think in some ways he wanted to live his life through his son, which of course he did succeed in doing so to a large extent. His racing debut was in 1915, Brighton. He was racing in various tourist trophy races with some success, which is what every racing driver had to do to achieve recognition or at least get into the league. And in 1952, he switched to single-seat racing with a sponsored Bristol-powered Cooper. That was partly funded by his father, and he won his first Formula 2 race at Goodwood. It's one of the, I think, iconic racing circuits. And his father used to race there, motorcycles and cars to some extent. Mike loved Goodwood. Trademark bow tie. He was known as Le Papillon by the French drivers. His beloved and very hot Jaguar Mark I 3.8 was a gorgeous car. There's a bit of history to this car, which I'm going to come on to later. It is an iconic motor car. It's the one in which he was killed, but he used to use it a lot. Jaguar partly sponsored this works car, so it was very hot and very loud. Coming out of post-war Britain, people used to group together in certain groups. Mike's group were nearly all racing drivers. One of the activities they used to enjoy was to drive as fast as they could around local Surrey pubs and imbibe, probably a bit more than they should have done. And this was usually by car, but you had to wear a tie. Without a tie, you couldn't actually be part of the team. The interesting thing is that the hostelries that actually Mike used to enjoy going to, the Bush Hotel, the Barley Mow was his favourite at Tilford, and there's some memorabilia there still. The Duke of Cambridge, where he was never allowed to buy a drink, again in Tilford. So he was very much a local lad, yet global. So he was a world champion, and he lived on our doorstep. Formula One came in 1952, and his debut race was in a Cooper Bristol, a sponsored car, and he finished fourth behind 3 Ferraris. He was disappointed with this, but actually it was an achievement, especially to even be anywhere near a Ferrari. And his first podium finish in third Formula One race at the British Grand Prix. And that's when Enzo Ferrari picked him up and said, "Can we talk?" Ferrari hired Hawthorn for the 1953 season, which was a massive breakthrough for Mike. And if you've ever watched the film Ferrari, it's not entirely representative of the achievements of the Ferrari racing team in those days, or the drivers. I think the film should have been called Enzo, because it was really about his family life, his history, his traumas and tribulations, and rescuing the firm by getting sponsorship from Fiat eventually. And they came in to bail him out because he was in huge financial difficulty. Mike was pictured in the film wearing a ratting cap, as he called it, opposite Stirling Moss around a meeting table. But there's very, very little else relating to Mike in the film, which is a pity because all the drivers were there, Peter Collins and everyone else, but there was no mention of the driving abilities of these people or their successes. An interesting quote from Innes Ireland, who you possibly have heard of, again a very famous racing driver in the 50s and one of his contemporaries. There simply never was a racing driver like Mike Hawthorn. His active racing years, 1952 to 1958, the Formula One teams that he raced with, Ferrari, Vanwall and BRM, but with a remarkably short competitive lifespan, achieved the lowest number of Grand Prix victories of any F1 world champion, and that still is the case today. His secret, which kind of overshadowed his entire life throughout his racing career, was a serious health issue affecting all aspects of his life, not just racing. Had Team Ferrari or any other racing team that he was racing for been aware, his racing career would have been finished. It was that serious. So due to this secret, certain behaviours and actions outside of racing came in for heavy criticism. He could be brusque, he could be rude, he could be arrogant and selective, and sometimes just shut down. And the reason for that was because he was under incredible pressure, a lot of pain, and particularly pain when racing. And he found it impossible to defend himself because if he had done, then the secret would have come out and lots of things would have not happened for him. So since childhood, he suffered serious kidney problems, and much of his racing career since 1955 functioning just on one kidney. The left kidney was lost and the other was seriously impaired. He was almost always in pain. He had to race with a body belt or sometimes two body belts, and he was told on many occasions by his doctors to give up racing. Do not race any longer because you'll die within a year if you don't. Of course, he ignored that. Blackouts were suspected, and there's an interesting aspect of that later on. At the time of his death, it was expected that he may only live 3 more years. That was the maximum. Mike was still a very young man, but a little chubby. And the reason for that is the medication he was on for the kidney problems and the pain. It did have an effect on his physical appearance. He didn't put weight on. This was something socially that he had to live with because national service was obviously in full swing. He was blamed and shamed by his contemporaries for not joining up. Obviously, the reason was never publicly given, but had he gone to a national service medical board, they would have immediately said no, and they would have said why, and therefore his career was at stake. And disclosure would have certainly cost him the career and everything else. Mike Hawthorn, the man, a few adjectives have been used to describe him, but what I said earlier is that what we need to overlay is the social norms of the time, the fact that we were coming out of World War II. His father had been a dashing fighter pilot in World War II. Everybody expected Mike to be the way he was. So flamboyant, arrogant and selective, not everyone's cup of tea. I think that's the one that probably fits the bill best. But then again, he would be exclusive. He wouldn't actually mix with everybody. So he was actually a little bit distant. A ladies' man for sure, and he had plenty of girlfriends, although he never married. He was caring and compassionate with his friends. He was very generous. He took responsibility for his own actions. He was charming, and that was one of the attributes that comes out in everything I've read. But he was driven and highly ambitious, which sometimes can alter someone's personality. But very courteous to other competitors, always a gentleman on the track, and of course, loyal to his favourite pubs. Mike, with fellow teammate, his best friend, Peter Collins. Pete was very close to Mike. They supported one another. It's suspected that Peter did know about his kidney problem. There were 1 or 2 people very close to him who did know about his health issues, but they never shared it with anyone. Had Mike lived, Stirling Moss might not be the name he was known later on in life. He was a rival and a friend, so there was a bit of rivalry there that was healthy, but Mike always thought he was a better driver, and who knows, he might have been. He was engaged to model Jean Howarth at the time of his death. She was considered very glamorous in her day, and she later married Innes Ireland. One of his friends and competitors became Jean Ireland. But she still held a torch for Mike. I think she was at the funeral and there was quite a relationship there. He never married, but he did father a son. He met a lady called Jacqueline Delaney, who he met after winning the French Grand Prix. They had a relationship, and that relationship didn't go any further, although he did keep in touch both with Jacqueline and his son well after the relationship ended. And Mike altered his will, ensuring that his son and his lady friend would be financially secure after his death. So that's one aspect of his personality, I think, that's on the plus side. So almost immediately after winning the World Championship, Mike retired from motor racing. This was largely prompted by the death of his close friend and Ferrari teammate, Peter Collins. Peter was a soulmate of Mike's. His death actually really hit home, and he decided enough is enough. And also, I think his health was deteriorating to such an extent that he didn't feel comfortable racing quite at the level he had been. An interesting point, after retirement, Mike began writing children's books. They featured a fictional racing character called Carlotti. There's a very long story to do with Carlotti, and she features in the film Ferrari. Carlotti joins the team, was published in 1958. Carlotti takes the wheel, 1959, but never published due to Mike's untimely death. He included himself in the books and other drivers, so I don't think anyone's ever seen one. There have to be some around. Just what did happen on the 22nd of January 1959. The country was basking in the reflected glory of a new Formula One world champion who was a Briton, which is something we never thought we would achieve. There was a chat on the forecourt of Tourist Trophy Garage in Farnham, interrupted by pal and road racing champion Rob Walker, who drove by in a grey Mercedes 300 SL. And the traditional two-fingered salute to Mike from Rob was like a red rag to a bull, so he couldn't resist. And so a pursuit ensued. Now, Mike was planning to go to Guildford to see some friends, and the route that Rob was taking was the lower Guildford Road coming out of Farnham. The whole road layout has changed now. The Hogsback was a fairly narrow road at that time, so bear in mind you've got traffic coming. Okay, 1950s traffic, not as busy as today, but still reasonably busy. You had lorries, you had vans, and of course they were going a lot slower. Mike jumped into his rather warmed up Jaguar and decided to follow. We could never use the word race, because apparently racing was actually very interestingly avoided during the inquiry. So they were on a fairly long and fairly straight stretch of road. The conditions at the time were dreadful. It was pouring with rain. It was a January day, gusty winds, not ideal conditions for a road. There were 15 serious accidents at this location, 2 fatal in the previous 2 years. To this day, controversy surrounds the reasons for the crash. Many theories have been put forward. Wet roads, the new Dunlop radial tyres fitted to the Jaguar. This car was not standard. It was seriously hot. There was some talk of a specially modified hand throttle that Mike had had fitted, because don't forget at Tourist Trophy they had their own workshops, they had their own technicians, and Jaguar had also made sure the car was fit for racing. So did the throttle jam open? There's no evidence to support this. In fact, because the wreckage wasn't around long enough, it was very difficult to get independent assessments. Mike's health. Did he suffer a blackout while he was driving? He'd been experiencing these lately. It could have well been the case. The theory has it that Jaguar found no fault with the car, which they retrieved very quickly. Funnily enough, that tree was the only one for miles around, and he happened to find it. It was quite a small tree, small trunk. It clipped the back of a lorry, and this spun the car out of control. But of course, with the wet roads and the new tyres, nobody had really been driving very much on radial tyres at that stage. Jaguar subsequently destroyed the car. At the inquiry, Rob Walker, the Mercedes driver, denied they had been racing, although at the inquiry it was estimated that both cars were travelling in excess of 100 miles an hour downhill on a stretch of wet and narrow road. Mike accelerated on a bend, clipping a lorry, and at that point Mike lost control. I think racing possibly was part of the issue. The car was actually an absolute wreck. Mike was thrown onto the back seat. At that stage he was still alive, but by the time he got to hospital he was not. estimated impact of the tree was 80 miles an hour plus. His body was formally identified by friend and fellow racing driver Duncan Hamilton. Duncan features a lot in any book you read on Mike Hawthorn. He was a very close friend. He was probably his closest friend. Duncan almost certainly knew about his health issues as well. Mike, only a single Grand Prix during his world title winning season and just 3 in his entire career. And by 55, it was evident that Mike was suffering blackouts, probably due to the kidney failure. Speculation that these two would have been contributed to his fatal crash. Just going to talk a little bit about the kidney problem. The reason that Mike suffered so long and without any real remedy was that there wasn't any technological help for people with kidney disease. There were no dialysis machines. So basically, you just had to suffer with it. And sadly, you would have a very limited life. So you could argue that the way Mike went out might have been the way he wanted to go out, in a blaze of glory. So why no public memorial in Farnham? I think it's evident that he deserves it. And he's one of our more modern heroes. His 50th anniversary was held in Farnham Town Centre on the 29th of January 2009. I remember taking my 2 children. It was a wonderful day. The streets of Farnham absolutely reverberated with the sound of a cavalcade of historic cars, many of which had been Mike's race cars, and driven by people like Damon Hill, Sterling Moss, Susie Moss, and many others. Mike's restored, or recreated, shall we say, Jaguar 3.4 Mark I was by far the loudest in the parade. The car took something like 10 years to recreate. Mechanically, it's as close as they could get to the original specification in terms of brake horsepower, which I think was about 248. It was a really grim time in motor racing. Luigi Musset, who does appear in the film Ferrari, Mike's teammate, was killed. Englishman Peter Collins was killed at the German Grand Prix in Nürburgring. Englishman Stuart Lewis Evans, Vandal, Moroccan Grand Prix. American Pat O'Connor. So Mike retired from motor racing after his win, only to lose his own life just 3 months later. A wake-up call. This is really what triggered the thought in the race organisers' minds, maybe we need to make motor racing a bit safer. It was a new concept in motor racing, actually, not only from the organisers' point of view and the team's point of view, but from the driver's point of view. A lot of them didn't want to be cosseted or made too safe. It was considered a dangerous sport, and at that time very much a man's sport, although that's not the case now, but it was a new concept. And after so much loss of life on the track, it was considered necessary to start looking at track safety, crash barriers, improved pit safety. A critical point in motor racing is pit, exit, and also the cars. So in terms of to avoid out-of-control cars on track, more mid-engine cars were developed and designed with better road holding. Tyre technology changed radically in that period. And the braking, of course. Going at those speeds, you've got to stop. And it wasn't always considered important to stop, more important to keep going. Ferrari still persisted with their front-engine cars until 1961. I don't know the reason for that, but it might have been because they just felt it was a better balance for the car. And all cars were different, they were all engineered differently. And Ferrari was still phenomenally successful. And following Mike's retirement, other people still achieved incredible results. Sterling Moss was one. The memorial in West Street Cemetery, Farnham, it was a massive turnout internationally, enormous numbers of people, racing drivers and those associated with racing, and just friends and acquaintances and fans. Hundreds of people were at the cemetery and at the church. I think just about every racing driver of any note at that time came along to the service. World champion Mike Hawthorn died the way he'd lived, on the limit, driving fast and having fun. Surely that's better than a slow and painful death from kidney disease.
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.